In the previous video, we discussed the overview of agile concepts. Let us now discuss how to configure Scrum Board. In this video, we are going to take a look at creating a Scrum Board in JIRA software, creating stories and associating them with epics and versions, backlog grooming. We will discuss how to estimate the stories. We will discuss how to plan and start a sprint. And finally, we'll take a look at various Scrum Board configurations in JIRA software. So right now I'm logged into my JIRA instance and I want to create a new project of type JIRA software. So I'll go to the projects option on top, and if I click on the create project, I have the options here to select various templates. So I can select Scrum, Kanban or basic software development template to create a new project. But for this example, I want to create a sample project that will contain some data. So I will click on this link called create sample data, and then I will select Scrum software development. Then I'll give my project a name. Let us say if I'm a project manager who is currently responsible for developing a mobile app for Android. So I'll give my project a name and I'll change my project key, and I'll leave my project lead to myself and I'll click on the submit button. So this will create a new project for me along with some sample data so that we can take a look at how the Agile Scrum Board looks like. So right now I am taken to one Agile board where I can see that there is one sprint running called as sample sprint 2, and right now I'm inside my active sprints. But I'll go back to my backlog, which is my first tab in my sidebar. So click on the backlog and you're now taken to the backlog where you have all the issues or stories in your Android project. So I'll collapse my sidebar and I'll work on my project now. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to take a look at the backlog that you have right now. So right now in my current project, I have 8 issues in my backlog, and usually you will have your stories listed under the backlog section of your Agile Scrum project. But you can also have a bug or any type of activity, and the input to any Agile board is usually defined in the filter, which is already configured for us. So what I will do to begin with, I will first create a new epic in my project. So there is a link here that says epics. If I click on it, I have the option to create a new epic. So if I'm working on my Android development project, I will probably create 2 different epics. So I will create one epic called as user interface, and I'll give my epic a summary, which can be same as my epic name. And then I'll create one more epic. So I'll select this check box here. And this time I want to give my epic a different name. So this time it could be validations, and I'll give my epic a summary name. And I'll click on the create button. So now I have defined and created 2 different epics in my Agile board. And before I start my sprint, the next thing that I want to do is I may want to link these epics to the stories that I have in the backlog. So usually when you start working on any Agile based project, you will have a backlog, and this backlog will be owned by your product owner. It could be the business analyst in your company, and you need to define their order in which you want to execute these stories. So this order is like a backlog grooming, where you are saying that you want to activate or you want to execute this particular story first, and this is the high priority story in the project. So before you start the sprint or before you even plan the sprint, you may want to associate the stories to one of these epics. So all you can do, you can just drag your stories from the backlog to the epic section on the left hand side. So you can actually see here that while you are dragging the issues from your backlog to the epic, you can see that there is a new label which is being added for you on the backlog view. So you can see here that we have some of the epics in user interface epic, and we have some of the stories linked to the validations. And once you define your epics and once you associate them to the stories, you need to also manage the versions. So right now in my sample Scrum board, I already have some versions defined. So I have one version called version 2.0 and I have version 3.0. And right now there is no issue associated with my version 3, which is currently in progress. And that is why it says issues 2, but none of them is complete or none of them is in progress. And that is why there is no progress bar here. But when you start working on the issues, when you start planning your sprints, and if there is any story which is getting completed or which is in progress, you will see a progress bar. And just like you associate your epics to your stories, you can do the same thing for your version. You simply need to drag the stories from your backlog to the specific version. So you can simply drag them and drop them in the right section. So you can see here that we have the epics in the project and we also have the versions. And your epics and versions are not directly related to the sprints that you're now going to plan. So it can take one or more sprints to finish one version or one epic. So the next thing that you need to do is create a new sprint. And by the way, in this particular project, we already have one sprint which is running. We will probably ignore it and create a new one. So I'll click on the create sprint button here and I'll drag some of the issues from my backlog to my sprint on top. So I can simply drag and drop them in the sprint section here. So you can drag one issue or you can drag in fact multiple issues from your backlog to the sprint. And when you add the stories from your backlog to the sprint, the next thing that you need to do is you need to estimate your individual stories and the individual issues that you have in the sprint. And this is called as your estimation of your stories. So in the current agile board, my estimation is by default set based on the story points, and this number here that actually signifies the current estimate. So right now for this particular story, my estimate is 2, and estimation based on story point is something which defines the complexity of the activity that you're doing, and you need to discuss it with the individual person who will be working on this particular story. So usually when you have your sprint planning meeting, you will discuss with all the team members that how much effort it will take for you to resolve this particular story, and based on their feedback you can enter the right estimate here. So let us say if the estimate for this particular story is 4, so I can just change it to 4 and I can save it in my story. And you can see here that the moment you change the estimate here, this will be reflected in the sprint planning here. And by the way, this particular sprint which you're right now planning, it is currently in a plan mode. You're going to start the sprint pretty soon. So make sure you define the sprint stories and you estimate them. And finally, you need to also change the order in which you want to execute the stories listed under the sprint. So this particular order is actually known as the rank of your sprint or the stories that you have in the sprint. So this rank is something that will let the developers know that you need to execute the first item listed in the sprint first, and then you need to follow the order. So this is a very good indication of the order which you want to follow for delivering this particular sprint. And before you start the sprint, also take a look at the estimate field here, because right now the total estimate based on the story points is 16, which is nothing but a simple total of all the story points. And right now you have 4 issues in the current sprint which are going to start pretty soon. However, the button to start the sprint is currently disabled because in JIRA you cannot really start or have 2 different sprints running simultaneously out of the box. But there is one feature which you can enable to have this parallel sprint enabled in this particular JIRA instance. So let me show you how we can enable this parallel sprint. So if I go to my JIRA admin and applications, and if you go to the JIRA software configuration, you have the option here to enable parallel sprints features. So just check this particular option and go back to your board. So to go back to the recent board, you can simply click on the board option on top and click on the Android board, and you will be taken back to the same board where you working on the sprint planning. So now you can see here that we are now inside the same board, and now the button to start the sprint is now enabled. So all you need to do, you need to just click on the button. So when you click on the button, you will have the option to give your sprint a name. So in my opinion, give your sprint some meaningful names, like right now, let us say you're working on a particular sprint for March or maybe mid-March. So give your sprint a name and also define a goal, because you need to have a goal for each and every sprint. And the whole idea of a sprint is to deliver something which is working, a working prototype. So this goal is good to have here defined so that people know that we have to achieve this goal. So we need to deliver a working Android app, and the sprint duration need to be defined as well. In my opinion, a 2-week sprint is a very good duration, and you need to define the start date as well as the end date if you are using a custom duration. But since you have a 2-week duration, which is letting us define only the start date, you don't have to change the end date. And it is currently saying that there are 10 working days in the sprint, and when you're ready to start the sprint, you will click on the button start. And usually you will start the sprint maybe on the first day of the week, or maybe when the sprint is going to be started. Let us say on Friday you plan your activity, and on Monday morning you want your sprint to be started. So just click on the button when you're ready to start the sprint. And the moment you start the sprint, you're now taken directly to the board where you can see all the active sprints running in your current project. And on top, you can see that there is a filter that says switch sprint. If you want to switch it to a different sprint, let us say we want to go back to the mid-March sprint, you can click on it. And now you can see that in this particular sprint, we have 4 issues. And right now the status of the issues is to do. And currently in my sprint board, we have 3 different columns: to do, in progress, and done. And let me show you how we can configure this column and how we can also create a new column if required. So if I click on the board drop down menu on top, and if I go to the configure, so the first configuration option is general, and in the general section you need to define the filter query for which you want to have this particular board configured. So in this particular board, I want all the issues from my project Android, and I want the order which is my rank, which is usually the case in most of the agile boards, but you can have your own filter if you want. The second option is the columns, where you can actually define different columns in your agile board. Let us say if you want to add a new column called as on hold, so you can simply type in the column name and click on the add button. And this new column is now added for you in the Scrum board. Now, if I go back to my board very quickly, I can see here that now we have a new column called on hold. And when the developer start working on their issues or on the stories, they can actually drag these stories from one column to another column. So let us say if I start the progress, I can just change my status from one status to another by simply dragging and dropping it to the next column. And if I want to also move my one of the story to on hold, so I can simply drag and drop it to the respective column defined in my agile board. And finally, when you think your work or your activity is now finished, you can actually drag it directly to the done column. And by the way, right now I'm using a simplified workflow in my project, and that is why I can move from any state to any state. So there is no constraint on the path that you need to follow. For example, you can have a normal work where you can define a route that you first need to start the progress, then you need to move the ticket to, let us say, some review state, and finally you can update your ticket status to resolve. So this need to be configured by your JIRA administrator, and if you have JIRA administrator rights, you will be able to configure your own workflow. But out of the box in JIRA, when you create a new project with JIRA software development template or Scrum, you will have a simplified workflow. So let us take a look at some more configurations. The next option that we have is to configure a swim lane. And swim lane is a very interesting concept because this swim lane will actually enable you to display the grouping based on either the type of the issue. For example, right now the swim lane is configured based on the stories, but you can also have swim lanes based on the assignee name and also on the basis of epics. So if I change my swim lane to epics, and if I go back to my board, I should be able to have a grouping which is based on my user interface, which is one of my epic. I have a validation epic, and I have all the issues listed that are not part of the epic. So this is quite useful, and this particular feature is really important because in case you have a story with some subtask, in that case you can also have a grouping based on the stories, and all the subtasks will be displayed right under a specific story. The next option that we have here is to configure a quick filter, and these quick filters are nothing but some links that appear on top of the agile board. So we already have a couple of quick filters enabled, for example, only my issues and recently created issues. If you go back to your agile board, you have these quick filters listed as these links on top. If you click on only my issues or recently updated issues, you can actually filter the board very quickly to display the issues based on the criteria defined in this quick filter. And these quick filters are usually based on the JQL. So if you already know how to search for the issues based on the JQL, you can configure your own quick filter. So let us move on to the next feature that we have in the Agile board. So you also have the option to change the color of the Agile board. For example, if you want to have the color of your Agile cards based on the issue types, so you can simply select issue type, or maybe you can also select the priority field if you want. So right now in this particular configuration, my epics will be displayed in this color, my subtask will be displayed in this particular color, and you have the option to change the color as well. So for example, if you want all these stories to be displayed in yellow color, so simply use the color of your choice, and when you go back to the Agile board, you will have this nice color displayed for all the cards based on the issue types. So now you can see here that we have a new color for the cards, and the color will be based on the type of the issue. So let us go back to the board configuration. So the next option that we have here is the card layout, and card layout is the feature where you will be able to add more fields in the card that will be displayed both on the backlog and as well as on the active sprint board where you will be working on the issues. So let us say if you also want to include a progress of your story along with maybe a new field. Let us say you want to also add your link. So when you add these additional fields in your card layout, you will be able to view them on the card directly. And this can be really useful because sometimes you want to display some additional information. So now if you go back to your Agile active board, you can see here that although we had Epic link, but we were able to add a few additional fields. So these fields can be any fields in JIRA that are relevant and useful for your team. Let me go back to the board configuration. The next option that we have is the estimation field, where we can actually define the estimation statistics. So by default, the Agile Scrum estimation statistics in JIRA software is based on story points, but you can also change it to original time estimate, because in some cases you want to use number of hours instead of story points. So you have the option to change it here, and make sure that whenever you change this particular option, you also take a look at the reports that will be generated, and we'll take a look at those reports in a future video. The next option that we have is the working days, and you have the option to define some non-working days. So by default, you have the option to select the time zone of your Agile board. Let us say if you have a team who is working on a specific time zone, you can set the time zone here, and you can also define your normal standard working days. So if you're working from Monday to Friday, you can define standard working days, and you also have the option to define the non-working days. So let us say if you have any holiday in your company, you can define those non-working days in the Agile board configuration. So let us say you want to define a couple of dates here, on which dates you think you will have holidays. So just select the date, and you will have that particular date configured in the Agile board. And the last option that you have is the issue detail view, where you can actually configure some additional fields that you want to display in your issue detail view that appears on the right hand side. For example, right now we have some fields like status, priority, component, label, versions, and epic. And you also have some date related fields, like let us say you want to also display due date along with created and updated date, and you have variety of other fields that you can configure. And if you go back to your Agile board, so when you click on any of these cards, you should be able to view the details of the issue, and based on the fields that you configure in the configuration of your board, you will be able to view those additional fields right in the issue detail view. So you can see that we have a lot of options to configure the Agile board. In the next video, we will discuss Configure Kanban board.